Every spring, across suburbs, driveways, and quiet little backyards in America, millions of people spend money trying to erase something that has already arrived for free. They spray it, rip it out, poison the soil around it, and call it a nuisance. But what if some of these so-called weeds are not intruders at all? What if they are survivors from an older world? Plants that fed the poor, stood beside ancient roads, appeared in sacred texts, and carried a kind of practical wisdom long before modern nutrition ever gave it a name. While supermarkets sell powders, capsules, and carefully packaged greens at premium prices, some of the most overlooked plants in the modern landscape still rise quietly through cracks in concrete and along the edges of forgotten fences, asking for nothing, offering more than most people realize. This video is for educational and documentary purposes only. It is not medical advice, and no single food can replace professional care, medication, or a balanced lifestyle. If you have a medical condition, allergies, or dietary restrictions, always speak with a qualified health professional. The ancient world did not have laboratories, food labels, or supplement aisles glowing under fluorescent lights. What it had was observation. It had hunger, hard labor, changing seasons, fragile bodies, and generations of people who learned, slowly and carefully, which plants nourished, which soothed, which strengthened, and which returned again and again when life became difficult. In the pages of Scripture, in the writings of Greek physicians, in folk memory carried across deserts, valleys, monasteries, and villages, we find a pattern that feels almost impossible to ignore. The very plants we dismiss today were often the ones closest to human survival. And as modern science looks more closely, that ancient pattern is beginning to make a surprising kind of sense. Tonight, we are walking through 15 plants that most people call weeds, but that history, tradition, and emerging research suggest deserve a second look. Some were eaten, some were brewed, some were pressed into wounds, steeped into teas, or gathered at the edges of fields by people who had little else. And by the time we reach number 1, a deeper pattern begins to appear, one that connects biblical landscapes, traditional healing, and modern biochemical research, in a way that feels less like coincidence and more like memory. And stay with me, because number 5 carries one of the most striking survival echoes in ancient scripture, and the science behind it is far more fascinating than most people would expect. Number 15. Red clover. Imagine an open field in the ancient Near East just after dawn. The air is still cool. A breeze moves through grain and low flowering plants beneath it. Shepherds pass in the distance. The land looks quiet, but beneath that quietness something important is happening. The soil is recovering. Nitrogen is returning. Small roots are doing the kind of invisible work civilization has always depended on. Among those flowering plants is red clover. Soft, pinkish, humble, easy to miss, unless you know what you are looking at. In the biblical imagination, the land is often described not only as productive, but as living, layered, generous. The agricultural world of the ancient Israelites depended on more than crops alone. It depended on the hidden cooperation between soil, rain, seed, and the plants that restored what hard use had taken away. Red clover belonged to that quieter category of abundance. It was not dramatic like wheat or olives. It did not arrive with the symbolism of wine or figs, but like many of the plant's history overlooks, it served from below, renewing the ground while offering nourishment of its own. Far beyond the biblical world, red clover appears again and again. In Celtic traditions, it carried protective meaning and practical value. In Chinese herbal practice, it was remembered in connection with respiratory discomfort. In European monastery gardens, where monks preserved generations of medicinal plant knowledge, it was cultivated with deliberate care. When cultures separated by geography and language keep returning to the same plant, that repetition matters. It does not prove everything, but it often suggests that people noticed something real long before science learned how to measure it. Modern research has paid particular attention to red clover because of a group of compounds called isoflavones, including biocanin A, formininettin, daidzein, and genistein. These are plant compounds sometimes described as phytoestrogens, meaning they can interact with estrogen receptors in the body in subtle and complex ways. That is one reason red clover has drawn interest in research related to menopause, bone health, and women's health more broadly. Some studies suggest that red clover isoflavones may help support bone maintenance and may be associated with reductions in certain menopausal symptoms, though results vary and the science is still being refined. What matters here is not exaggerated promise, but the fact that this small flowering plant has enough biochemical activity to keep researchers looking closely. Its flowers and young leaves are edible. The blossoms can be dried into a mild tea with a soft sweetness. The younger tops can be scattered into salads, where they bring color and a gentle floral note rather than intensity. It is the kind of plant that does not shout. It offers quietly. And that may be part of why the modern world overlooks it. We have become trained to notice the dramatic, the branded, the processed, the loudly marketed. Red clover belongs to an older rhythm, one where usefulness was often soft-spoken. Of course, because it has meaningful biological activity, it should be approached with respect. Those who are pregnant, breastfeeding, or dealing with hormone-sensitive conditions should speak with a qualified health professional before using it regularly. Ancient people may not have used the language of receptor pathways and endocrine signaling, but they did understand something equally important. A powerful plant is not the same thing as a casual plant. And that is what makes red clover such an interesting place to begin. It reminds us that value is not always loud, and that some of the oldest forms of nourishment enter the story not through spectacle, but through patience. Long before it became the subject of modern studies, long before capsules and extracts placed it into neat commercial bottles, it was already there in the field, restoring the land and waiting to be noticed. Number 14. Chickweed. Now the scene shifts from open fields to the quiet edges of cultivated land, the places most people hardly notice. A narrow strip beside a stone wall, the shaded corner of a garden. The damp margin where footsteps pass but harvest does not. In the ancient world, these edges mattered. They were where the poor gathered, where the overlooked searched for what still remained, where survival often lived in smaller, softer forms. Chickweed belongs to that world. It is low to the ground, tender, almost delicate in appearance, the sort of plant a hurried eye would dismiss without thought. But in many traditional cultures it was not dismissed at all. It was gathered. Leviticus describes the practice of leaving the corners of the fields unharvested so that the poor and the stranger could glean what remained. It is one of the most humane agricultural instructions in Scripture, and it also reveals something subtle about the ancient landscape. Food did not exist only in the crop itself, it existed in the margins, in the plants that arrived uninvited, in the species that appeared where grain had been cut and shade met moisture, in the small green companions of settled human life. Chickweed, Stellaria media, grows exactly in those conditions: disturbed soil, cool temperatures, partial shade. It has followed human habitation for centuries, almost as if it understands where need tends to gather. Roman soldiers are said to have carried it dried as a practical travel food. Traditional Chinese medicine valued it in external preparations for irritated skin and inflammation. In European folk practice, it appeared in remedies connected to swelling, urinary discomfort, and general cooling support. Once again, the pattern appears, quiet, but persistent. Different civilizations, different climates, different medical philosophies, and yet this same small plant keeps returning to the record. Nutritionally, chickweed offers more than its fragile appearance suggests. It contains vitamin C and B, along with minerals such as calcium, iron, and phosphorus. It also carries flavonoids, including quercetin, compounds that modern research has studied for antioxidant and anti-inflammatory potential. Some work has also examined the presence of saponins and coumarin-like compounds that may help explain why chickweed earned its old reputation as a gentle circulatory and topical support plant. None of this turns it into a miracle. It simply means the old instinct to gather it may have had real biochemical reasons behind it. There is something especially revealing in the way chickweed was traditionally prepared. Unlike plants that tolerate heat well, chickweed is at its best when treated gently. Long cold infusions, fresh poultices, or raw use preserve more of what makes it valuable. A hot boil can flatten much of its subtlety. The older traditions seem to understand this without needing to explain it through chemistry. They simply noticed what worked. A handful steeped slowly in cool water. Fresh leaves bruised and pressed. Tender shoots added uncooked to spring meals when the body was coming out of winter and looking for green life again. Its flavor is mild, almost grassy, with none of the aggression people expect from wild plants. It does not force itself into the meal. It joins it softly. That quality feels almost symbolic. Chickweed is not a plant of spectacle, it is a plant of provision. It appears when little else is growing, in places where no one planned for it, and offers quiet nourishment to those willing to look down instead of past. That may be why it has remained almost invisible to modern culture. We are trained to seek power in size, branding, and rarity. Chickweed offers a different lesson. Some of the most faithful forms of nourishment are the ones that arrive without announcement, in the margins, where only careful people think to gather them. And the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to call that an accident. Number 13. Wood sorrel. There are some plants that seem to carry a kind of brightness within them, even before you taste them. Wood sorrel is one of those. It appears in shaded corners, beneath trees, along damp forest edges, opening its small folded leaves and delicate flowers like a secret kept close to the earth. To anyone unfamiliar with it, it looks almost ornamental, too gentle to matter. But a single bite changes that impression immediately. There is a flash of lemon on the tongue, vivid and clean, as if the plant has somehow distilled light into flavor. And in older traditions, that brightness was never ignored. In wilderness settings, plants like wood sorrel often mattered because they offered more than calories. They brought relief. They refreshed the mouth, sharpened dull food, and gave a small but meaningful sense of renewal in places where meals could easily become repetitive and nutritionally narrow. The world of Exodus, with its deserts, scarcity, and dependence on what could be found or carried, is a world where such a plant would not have been trivial. Across much of history, the smallest edible greens often made the greatest difference when stored food ran thin and the body needed something living again. Ancient Egyptians used species of sorrel medicinally. Native American communities across North America worked with related plants in both diet and botanical practice. Medieval European herbalists valued wood sorrel in contexts connected to cooling, digestion, and fevers. Again, the same pattern emerges, not as dramatic proof, but as repeated human attention. A plant does not remain in the memory of separated cultures for centuries, unless it has earned its place there somehow. The chemistry of wood sorrel explains part of that fascination. It contains oxalic acid, the same naturally occurring compound found in spinach, beet greens, and rhubarb. That is what gives it its striking tartness. In modest quantities, that acidity can make food feel fresher and more stimulating, which may help explain why it was historically used as a brightening herb in heavy or bland diets. Wood sorrel also contains vitamin C in amounts that surprise many people given its size, along with malic acid, a compound involved in cellular energy pathways and frequently discussed in modern conversations about fatigue and metabolic support. It is a small plant with a surprisingly alive profile. At the same time, this is one of those plants that teaches balance. Because of its oxalic acid content, it was traditionally used as an accent rather than a staple. That old restraint turns out to be wise. People prone to calcium oxalate kidney stones are often advised to be cautious with foods high in oxalates, and wood sorrel belongs in that conversation. Ancient knowledge once again often arrived at moderation not through laboratory caution but through lived rhythm. A little was appreciated, too much was unnecessary. The best way to experience wood sorrel is exactly how older traditions often did: fresh, raw, and lightly used. A few leaves and flowers scattered over a salad transform it. The tartness lifts everything around it. It does not behave like a vegetable so much as a natural seasoning, a wild brightness. That may be why fine dining kitchens today buy from specialty foragers what many homeowners or gardeners still pull out without a second thought. Underneath the modern plating and boutique market language is something very old. People continue to value what wakes up the palate and reminds the body what freshness feels like. Wood sorrel is a beautiful example of how ancient food wisdom often lived in proportion. Not every plant was a staple. Not every wild food was meant to fill the bowl. Some existed to sharpen, cool, awaken, and complete. And in that sense, this small tart leaf carries a lesson larger than itself. Health is not always built through excess. Sometimes it is built through the right touch, in the right amount, given at the right moment. The ancient world understood that instinctively. Modern science is only beginning to explain why. Number 12. Wild violet. There is something almost too elegant about the wild violet for the modern imagination to take seriously. Its flowers look decorative, almost fragile, as though they belong in poetry more than in food history. Yet that is exactly where so many useful plants hide. Behind beauty, behind softness, behind the assumption that the delicate must also be insignificant, wild violet has been quietly disproving that assumption for centuries. Imagine a spring hillside after rain, the ground still dark with moisture, the air cool, the earth beginning to loosen after winter. Small violet blooms appear low among the green, catching light in brief flashes of purple and blue. In ancient landscapes, flowering plants were not merely admired, they were watched. Their arrival signaled season, climate, abundance, and often the return of specific foods and remedies. In a world that lived close to the rhythms of weather and land, blossoms were information. The Song of Solomon speaks in the language of flourishing landscapes, of flowers, fragrance, and awakening life. While the text is poetic rather than botanical instruction, it reflects a broader truth of the ancient world. Flowers belong to the emotional and material life of people. They marked beauty, yes, but also vitality and provision. Wild violet, part of a genus that has been used across cultures for food and medicine, fits naturally into that world. Ancient Greek physicians used violet flowers and leaves in preparations associated with headaches and heat-related discomfort. Medieval European apothecaries recommended violet in syrups and herbal infusions for irritation of the throat and chest. Cherokee traditions included violet leaves in both food and botanical care. When a plant appears across such different systems, the question is no longer whether people noticed it. The question becomes what they noticed so consistently. Modern nutritional analysis gives us part of the answer. Wild violet leaves contain notable levels of vitamins A and C, and the flowers carry anthocyanins, the same broad family of antioxidant pigments associated with berries and other deeply colored plants. There is also rutin, a flavonoid that has drawn research interest in relation to vascular support and capillary strength. As always, these findings should be held with care rather than hype. The point is not to turn violet into a medical promise. The point is to recognize that beauty and biological value often coexist more often than modern food culture expects. Violet's culinary use is one of the gentlest on this list. The flowers can be added raw to salads, candied, or steeped into syrups that carry a soft floral note and a pale jewel-like color. The leaves, especially when young, can be added to spring greens. There is something almost ceremonial about eating a plant like this. It reminds you that nourishment is not always heavy or practical looking. Sometimes it arrives as color, softness, and quiet chemistry wrapped together in a form that invites attention rather than hunger alone. And perhaps that is part of the deeper appeal. Wild violet stands at the intersection of nourishment and tenderness. It suggests that the old world did not separate health from beauty as sharply as we do now. A useful plant could also be lovely. A remedy could also be graceful. A flower in the field might be medicine, food, symbol, and pleasure at once. Modern markets now sell edible flowers at prices that would have seemed absurd to the people who once gathered them from the land directly. Yet beneath the packaging and trend language, the truth remains unchanged. Wild violet has always offered more than appearance. It is one more reminder that what we dismiss as decorative may in fact belong to a much older and wiser category, one in which beauty itself was never considered useless. Number 11. Mullein. If some plants seem born for gardens, mullein seems born for aftermath. It rises where things have been disturbed, where fire has passed, where soil has been exposed, where roads cut through old ground and abandonment has left space behind. Tall, pale, almost candle-like mullein stands above the roughness around it with an eerie calm. It is one of those plants that looks ancient, even when it is new, as though it belongs naturally to ruins, borders, and landscapes in recovery. That is part of what makes it so compelling in historical memory. In the book of Ezekiel, the language of brokenness and restoration appears again and again, dry places waiting for life to return. Mullein is not named there, but it belongs to that visual world. It is a pioneer species, meaning it is among the first to return when land has been damaged or stripped. Even ecologically, it is a plant of beginning again. Ancient Greek physician Dioscorides described mullein in relation to lung and respiratory complaints nearly 2,000 years ago, and his text shaped medical thought for centuries afterward. In Appalachian traditions, mullein was brewed or prepared in ways intended to soothe the chest. In parts of Ireland, it entered folk practice in milk-based preparations connected to deep respiratory weakness. In Turkey, even the dried flowers found their way into older customs aimed at calming irritation. The lungs and throat. These traditions did not emerge from a single source. They appeared in parallel, in different worlds, around the same plant. Modern science gives us a clearer picture of why. Mullein contains mucilage, a gel-like substance known for its soothing quality on irritated tissues. It also contains saponins, which are often discussed in herbal literature for their expectorant potential, helping loosen and move mucus. Then there is verbascicide, a compound that has attracted interest for anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial effects in laboratory research. None of this means mullein replaces medical care. It means there are plausible biochemical reasons behind the plant's long-standing association with the respiratory system. One of the most revealing details about mullein is how carefully it had to be prepared. The leaves are covered in tiny hairs, and those hairs can become irritating if they are not strained out properly. Older traditions knew this. The tea was not casually poured through an ordinary sieve and forgotten. It was filtered carefully, often through cloth, because people had learned through experience that the same plant that soothed could also irritate if handled carelessly. This kind of practical wisdom matters. It shows that traditional use was not blind faith. It was method shaped by repetition. A properly made mullein infusion is mild, earthy, and surprisingly gentle. It feels almost soft in character, which matches the role it has played in so many traditions. And still, mullein carries another layer of meaning beyond the cup. Before the age of modern supply chains, in places where formal medicine was far away or too expensive, plants like this were not alternative wellness trends. They were what people had. They were field medicine, household medicine, roadside medicine, inherited medicine. There is a dignity in that reality. Mullein did not become respected because it was fashionable. It became respected because generation after generation found that, in certain contexts, it helped. The people who relied on it were not trying to build an online health identity. They were trying to get through winter, chest illness, exhaustion, distance, and uncertainty. That is why mullein feels so powerful in a video like this. It represents a whole category of forgotten intelligence. The intelligence of noticing what grows back first, what soothes, what hurts, and what stands ready in damaged places without asking for cultivation. Mullein is not just a plant of the lungs. It is a plant of recovery itself. And the next plant may surprise you even more because it does not merely survive in hard conditions. It thrives in them, carrying a nutritional density so remarkable that modern food culture has somehow managed to ignore it in plain sight. Number 10. Lamb's quarters. By late summer, when gardens are tired and cultivated, greens have begun to fade, another plant often stands fully alive at the edge of the plot. Vigorous, dusty green, almost silver in the morning light. Lamb's quarters is not ornamental. It does not ask to be admired. It grows with the confidence of something that has survived far longer than the modern backyard. Its leaves are soft, almost goosefoot-shaped, and its presence is so common that most people pull it before ever learning its name. But in older worlds, this was not a plant you discarded lightly. It was food. The prophet Ezekiel speaks from a landscape marked by scarcity, exile, and coarse survival. In such conditions, the line between crop and wild plant becomes much thinner than modern abundance allows us to imagine. Across the ancient Near East and well beyond it, people ate whatever the land could still offer when cultivated systems failed or ran thin. Lamb's quarters, part of the wider Chenopodium family, belongs to that history of resilience. It is related to the same botanical line that later gave us quinoa, one of the most celebrated grains in modern health culture. The irony is difficult to miss. We pay premium prices for one member of the family while tearing out another for free. Its historical footprint is remarkably wide. Indigenous communities across North America gathered both its leaves and seeds. European peasant communities relied on Chenopodium species during lean seasons and famine years. In Mesoamerica, close relatives were cultivated deliberately. What emerges from these scattered records is not the story of a novelty food, but of a dependable one. This was a plant people turned to when nourishment mattered more than status. And nourishment is exactly where lamb's quarters becomes difficult to ignore. It contains impressive amounts of vitamin A and vitamin C, along with calcium, iron, potassium, and a meaningful amount of plant protein for a leafy green. On several nutritional measures, it compares surprisingly well to spinach, and in some cases surpasses it. That kind of density helps explain why so many traditional foodways kept it close. It was not gathered out of desperation alone. It was gathered because it was worth gathering. Like spinach and a number of other wild greens, lamb's quarters contains oxalates, which is why preparation matters. The older leaves benefit from brief cooking, just enough to soften texture and reduce the compounds that can interfere with mineral absorption. Younger leaves can be eaten raw in smaller amounts, but a quick steam or blanch often reveals the plant at its best. Sautéed gently in olive oil with garlic, it becomes rich, mineral, almost deep in flavor, as though the soil itself had become edible. It tastes older than supermarket greens, more serious, more rooted. That seriousness may be part of what makes it easy to overlook. Modern food culture tends to favor the polished, the standardized, the conveniently packaged. Lamb's quarters feels too close to the ground for that. It reminds us of a time when people knew that food did not have to be cultivated in neat rows to be valuable. Sometimes the most nourishing thing in sight was the one growing uninvited among the crops, waiting for someone to recognize that abundance often arrives without branding, and that recognition changes something. The moment you understand that this so-called weed is a nutritional relative of quinoa, richer than many store-bought greens, and historically trusted across continents, the whole category begins to collapse. It is no longer just a plant in the wrong place. It becomes evidence that our hierarchy of food has been shaped as much by commerce as by nourishment. The next plant reveals that even more sharply, because few plants have fallen farther in public reputation while carrying a medicinal and nutritional history as deep as the one that follows. Number 9. Dandelion. Few plants have been as thoroughly insulted by modern suburbia as the dandelion. It appears, bright and unbothered, in a carefully managed lawn, and instantly becomes the enemy. Whole industries exist to remove it. Yet for most of human history, a plant like this would have been recognized very differently. Its leaves are edible, its root is useful, its bitterness has purpose, its persistence is almost legendary. Dandelion is not an accident of neglect. It is one of the most adaptable food and medicinal plants in the human story. In the book of Exodus, bitter herbs are eaten as part of the Passover meal, carrying remembrance through taste. Scholars debate the exact botanical identities behind those ancient references, but the symbolic and physiological role of bitter plants is clear. They were not random additions. They belonged to a category of foods understood to wake the body, sharpen digestion, and speak of suffering and endurance at the same time. Dandelion belongs naturally in that world. Its bitterness is not a flaw. It is a language. Traditional Chinese medicine used dandelion root in ways connected to heat and liver discomfort. European herbalists treated it as both a digestive bitter and a gentle diuretic. Ayurvedic practice also recognized the value of bitter greens in supporting internal balance. Again, cultures far removed from each other arrived at strikingly similar instincts. Wherever dandelion grew, people eventually learned not just to tolerate it, but to use it. Modern analysis reveals why that old respect lasted. Dandelion greens are rich in vitamins A, C, and K, along with potassium and other minerals that many diets fail to provide consistently. The root contains bitter compounds such as taraxacin and a variety of polyphenols that have drawn scientific interest in digestion, liver support, and inflammation-related pathways. Some preliminary research has explored dandelion in relation to glucose metabolism and antioxidant effects, though that work remains early and should be described with caution. Still, it is enough to show that this plant's reputation did not emerge from fantasy. The real secret with dandelion is timing. A leaf harvested early, before the flower stalk rises, is a different experience from one gathered later in the season. Early leaves are tender and only gently bitter, pleasant enough in salads with oil and acid to round them out. Later leaves grow sharper, more assertive, the kind of bitterness that can feel overwhelming unless handled well. Traditional kitchens learned to tame that edge through soaking, blanching, and careful paring. Nothing was wasted simply because it required understanding. The root carries its own story. Roasted slowly, then brewed, it becomes a dark, earthy drink with an almost coffee-like depth, though without caffeine. In difficult economies and older households, drinks like this were not lifestyle substitutions. They were practical, nourishing alternatives shaped by need and familiarity. Even now, the smell of roasted dandelion root carries something old in it. Something from kitchens where people knew how to draw value out of what others stepped over. There is a deeper symbolic beauty to dandelion as well. Its leaves are bitter, its flower bright, its seeds airborne. It passes through multiple identities with ease, as though refusing to be fixed in a single use. Food, bitter tonic, flower, root beverage, pollinator support, a lawn pest. Few plants tell the truth more clearly about how culture shapes perception. We do not merely decide what a plant is based on what it contains. We decide based on what our system has room to value. The ancient world had more room. It understood that bitterness had a place, that resilient plants deserved attention, and that what arrived in abundance was often worth learning rather than destroying. Dandelion may be one of the clearest examples on this list of how modern convenience has narrowed our senses. But the next plant goes even further, because it asks something strange at first. To benefit from it, you must first be willing to be stung. Number 8. Stinging nettle. At first glance, stinging nettle seems like the kind of plant nature created to enforce boundaries. Brush against it carelessly and it answers immediately with heat, irritation, and an unforgettable lesson in attention. It is not a soft plant. It does not invite the body without conditions. And yet, across centuries and continents, people kept returning to it, gathering it, drying it, steeping it, cooking it, and in some traditions even deliberately applying its sting. That kind of persistence tells you something before science ever enters the frame. A plant this inconvenient does not remain beloved unless it gives back far more than it demands. The letter of James speaks of the farmer waiting on the rains, trusting in what the land will bring in its season. Nettle is one of those plants that returns with remarkable loyalty wherever the soil is rich, moist, and disturbed. It rises near human life, near old habitations, near the places where nutrients collect and the ground remembers activity. In that sense, it feels like a plant of restoration and return, one that appears not in pristine wilderness but in the lived-in places where people and soil have shaped each other over time. Ancient Egyptian medical writings mention nettle in relation to joint pain and inflammation. Roman soldiers stationed in colder regions are said to have used it to stimulate circulation, striking or rubbing the legs to bring heat back into the body. Indigenous traditions in North America also turned to nettle in foodways and practical care, particularly in relation to mineral nourishment, women's health, and seasonal rebuilding. Once again, the pattern reappears. Different cultures, different languages, different climates, and still nettle keeps arriving as useful. Its chemistry explains why. Once the sting is neutralized, usually by a brief blanch or cooking, nettle reveals itself as one of the most nutrient-dense greens available. It contains vitamins A, C, and K, along with iron, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and silica. That combination is especially striking because it speaks not just to calories or flavor, but to rebuilding, to replenishment, to the kinds of minerals that support blood, connective tissue, bone, and nervous system function. In populations coming out of winter, periods of illness, or exhausting labor, a plant like this would have mattered deeply. Nettle also contains chlorophyll, flavonoids, and a range of plant compounds being studied for antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects. Its long-standing use in joint and allergy-related discussions has drawn scientific interest, though the evidence varies depending on preparation and context. Even so, the sheer nutritional force of the plant is undeniable. This is not simply a medicinal herb, it is a serious food. Preparation changes everything. 30 seconds in boiling water disarms the sting, and what was defensive becomes nourishing. That transformation feels almost symbolic. The very quality that makes nettle difficult is part of what teaches you how to approach it. Respect first, then reward. Properly cooked nettle can be folded into soups, omelets, pastas, pestos, and broths, where its flavor lands somewhere between spinach and something darker, earthier, more mineral. As a tea, especially when steeped covered to preserve aromatic compounds, it becomes gentler, though still substantial. The sort of infusion that feels like it is doing more than simply warming you. There is also something unforgettable about the fact that people once used nettle not despite its sting, but through it. That old practice of urtication, deliberately applying the fresh plant to aching joints, sounds bizarre to modern ears, yet it emerged because people were watching closely. They were not asking whether something sounded fashionable. They were asking whether the body changed afterward, whether pain moved, whether circulation improved, whether life became a little easier. Observation created those traditions, not theory. Nettle reminds us that valuable things are not always pleasant at first contact. Some of the most powerful forms of nourishment ask for knowledge before they offer their gift. That is true of land. It is true of history. And it is certainly true of this plant. Once you learn how to approach it, you stop seeing an irritant and start seeing one of the most generous green foods the wild world still produces. And that prepares us for the next plant, because what comes next does not just challenge our assumptions, it overturns them completely. Number 7. Purslane. There are plants that are useful, plants that are interesting, and then there are plants that force a complete rearrangement of what you thought you knew. Purslane is one of those. It spreads low to the ground, often between cracks in pavement, along garden edges, across bare, dry soil where almost nothing else seems interested in living. Its stems are reddish and succulent, its leaves small and rounded, its flowers tiny and yellow. Most Americans see it and think only one word: weed. But in other parts of the world, purslane is sold in markets, cooked in home kitchens, praised in traditional medicine, and increasingly studied with the kind of scientific fascination usually reserved for far more expensive foods. The World Health Organization has described Portulaca oleracea as one of the most widely used medicinal plants in traditional systems, and that statement alone should give pause. A plant that homeowners spray as a nuisance has been recognized globally as medically and nutritionally significant. That gap between perception and reality is part of what makes purslane so astonishing. In Mexico, it is cherished as verdolaga. In parts of the Mediterranean, it has long been folded into salads and rustic dishes. In Chinese traditions, it carries a history deep enough to be associated with longevity. The modern American lawn may dismiss it, but history does not. What makes purslane so extraordinary is not merely that it is edible, it is what it contains. Purslane is one of the richest plant sources of omega-3 fatty acids known, particularly alpha-linolenic acid, and what has fascinated researchers even more is that it has shown traces of longer-chain omega-3 activity rarely discussed in land plants. It also contains vitamin E, beta-carotene, magnesium, potassium, vitamin C, and betalains, those vivid antioxidant compounds more commonly associated with beets. Then there is the detail that feels almost unbelievable until you see it repeated in the literature. Purslane also contains melatonin, the hormone-like compound involved in regulating sleep cycles, in unusually notable amounts for a common edible plant. This is where purslane stops being just another wild green and becomes something closer to a biochemical event hiding in plain sight. For a person living under stress, eating a monotonous diet, low in fresh foods, and physically depleted by climate or labor, a plant like this would not simply add flavor, it would add something the body could feel, not as a miracle, not as a cure, but as a meaningful nutritional intervention from the land itself. Traditional preparation understood one simple thing about purslane that modern kitchens sometimes forget. The less aggressively you treat it, the more of its delicate value you preserve. Purslane is excellent raw. Its stems have a slightly crisp, juicy quality, and its flavor is mild, faintly lemony, refreshing without becoming assertive. It belongs beautifully in salads, cool grain bowls, chopped relishes, and quick pickles. High heat can flatten some of what makes it so compelling, especially the fatty acid profile that has drawn so much modern interest. The old instinct to eat it fresh turns out to be deeply sensible. There is also something visually symbolic about purslane. It grows flat, close to the earth, never dramatic, never towering. It does not advertise its importance. You have to know what you are looking at. That may be why it works so well as a turning point in a video like this. By the time we reach number 7, a pattern is becoming hard to ignore. The most valuable plants are often the ones modern culture has trained us not to see. Not because they are hidden, but because they are too common, too ordinary, too lacking in commercial theater. And yet, purslane may be one of the clearest examples of the ancient world quietly outsmarting the modern one. While we bottle omega-3s, market sleep support, and debate mineral deficiencies in processed diets, this plant still rises from hot soil and cracked concrete, carrying a profile so unusual that researchers continue to pay attention. Learn to identify it once, and you begin to see it everywhere. More importantly, you begin to realize how much abundance can disappear from awareness without ever leaving the ground. Stay with me, because the next section moves even deeper into the territory where survival, scripture, and restoration begin to overlap. What comes next is not just about what a plant contains. It is about what a body reaches for when the journey becomes too great. Number 6. Plantain. Not the tropical fruit, but the low green plant that lies close to the ground. Broad-leaved, ribbed, ordinary-looking, almost impossible to notice unless you have been taught to notice it. Plantain grows where people walk, along paths, beside doorways, in compacted soil, at the edges of human movement. It is one of those plants that seems to follow civilization itself, quietly appearing wherever the earth has been pressed down by feet, wheels, labor, and time. In that way, it feels less like a wild plant in the distant sense, and more like a companion species, something that has traveled alongside human history for so long that it has become part of our forgotten background. There is a moment in 1 Kings that feels almost unbearably human. Elijah, exhausted beyond language, collapses in the wilderness. He lies down beneath the sparse shelter of a tree and asks for his life to end. Then comes a touch, then rest, then food, then water, then rest again. Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. It is one of the most intimate scenes of physical and spiritual depletion in Scripture, and it matters here because it frames something ancient people understood deeply. Survival is not always dramatic. Sometimes it comes through quiet restoration, through what soothes, what nourishes, what calms the body enough to continue. In the landscapes of the ancient Near East, and in traditional healing systems far beyond it, plantain belonged to that category of practical restoration. Greek physicians documented plantain in connection with wounds and irritation. Medieval European herbalists used it as a poultice and an infusion. Chinese traditions also recognized related species in contexts involving the lungs, the urinary system, and inflammatory discomfort. Indigenous healers in North America, when confronted with the spread of European broadleaf plantain, recognized in it something familiar enough to incorporate quickly. It was not a glamorous herb. It was a useful one. That distinction matters. The most trusted plants in history are often not the rarest or the most exotic. They are the ones that repeatedly prove themselves under ordinary pressure. Modern science has identified compounds in plantain that help explain that reputation. One of the most discussed is aucubin, an iridoid glycoside studied for anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and tissue protective effects in laboratory settings. Plantain also contains mucilage, that soft, gel-like substance that helps coat and soothe irritated tissues. This helps make sense of the plant's old association with both throat irritation and topical relief. There is also a practical intelligence to how quickly people learn to use it on bites, stings, and minor skin distress. Crush a fresh leaf until it glistens and press it gently against the skin, and the sensation of cooling relief can feel surprisingly immediate. Not magical, just direct. As a tea, plantain is gentle, mild, almost plain in the best sense of the word. It coats rather than excites. It softens rather than stimulates. That may be why it has lasted so long in domestic herbal traditions. Not every plant is memorable because it is intense. Some become indispensable because they are dependable. Plantain belongs to that quieter class of usefulness, the kind that earns trust slowly, then keeps it for generations. There is another layer here that makes plantain especially fascinating. A close botanical relative, Plantago ovata, gives the modern world psyllium husk, one of the most commercially successful fiber supplements in the pharmacy aisle. The mechanism that made psyllium valuable did not appear out of nowhere. It was already present in the family. Even now, hidden in this modest ground-hugging plant is the same broader lesson repeated throughout this video. The modern market often packages, standardizes, and sells back to us something the land had already been offering in a simpler form. Plantain teaches a different way of seeing. It tells us to look down where people have walked, where the ground is compacted, where life seems least glamorous. That is where this plant thrives. That is where quiet help often lives. And in that sense, plantain is almost a perfect symbol for endurance. It grows under pressure, it restores without spectacle. It travels with us whether we notice it or not. And now we come to a plant tied not only to healing traditions, but to one of the most vivid food memories in Scripture. A plant family so valued in the ancient world that it fed laborers, flavored longing, and still carries biochemical power strong enough that even modern research has had to pay attention. Number 5. Wild garlic and garlic mustard. In the book of Numbers, there is a moment of complaint so specific it feels startlingly real. The Israelites, deep in the wilderness, do not merely say they miss food. They name it. Fish, cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, garlic. It is one of the most human passages in Scripture, because memory is often carried through taste more powerfully than through argument. When people are exhausted, displaced, and worn thin by uncertainty, they remember sharp flavors, familiar foods, things that once made the body feel strong and anchored. Garlic appears in that list for a reason. In the ancient world, it was never just seasoning. Egyptian laborers were historically associated with garlic and onions as foundational foods of endurance. Greek and Roman cultures prized the allium family not only for flavor, but for vigor, practical health, and daily resilience. In other words, long before modern nutrition turned compounds into talking points, ancient civilizations had already assigned garlic a place close to labor, immunity, and human stamina. It was food with consequence. Wild garlic, often known as ramsons in Europe, carries that old allium identity into woodland landscapes. Garlic mustard, though botanically different, occupies a strangely parallel place in North America. Pungent, invasive, abundant, and often dismissed precisely because it grows too well. That is part of the irony. Conservationists urge its removal because of the ecological pressure it places on native species, and at the same time it remains edible, flavorful, and biochemically interesting. It is rare that a plant can be both a forest problem and a kitchen opportunity, but garlic mustard manages to become both. The key compound most people associate with garlic is allicin, produced when the plant's tissues are crushed or chopped, releasing the chemistry that gives garlic its unmistakable bite. Allicin has been studied extensively in relation to cardiovascular support, microbial activity, and immune-related functions. Research varies depending on the form and preparation, but the consistent theme is clear enough. This family of plants has real activity. Garlic mustard also brings glucosinolates into the conversation, the same broad compound family that helps give cruciferous vegetables much of their modern scientific interest. Suddenly, the old love for pungent spring greens begins to look less random and more deeply intelligent. The preparation matters enormously. Heat can diminish some of the very compounds that make these plants interesting in the first place. That is why traditional raw or lightly handled uses are so revealing. Young wild garlic leaves pounded into a pesto-like paste with oil and acid. Garlic mustard leaves blended fresh and added at the end rather than cooked into submission. Chopped leaves stirred into warm food just before serving, letting aroma and chemistry survive together. Ancient people did not explain this in terms of temperature thresholds and compound degradation. They simply learned that certain uses felt stronger, brighter, more effective than others. There is also something emotionally rich about garlic in Scripture. It is not remembered as luxury, but as force. It belongs to the memory of bodily strength, of meals that sustained workers, of flavors that cut through fatigue and monotony. In that sense, garlic is more than a food. It is a memory of vitality, a reminder that sharp, earthy plants often played a central role in helping people endure hard climates and hard labor. Wild garlic and garlic mustard stand at a fascinating crossroads between old appetite and modern science. They remind us that the plants people crave in memory are often the ones that did the most for them physically. Strong flavor was not merely preference. Sometimes it was information. Sometimes the body longed for what it had learned to associate with strength. And that brings us to a plant with a very different kind of power. One far more controversial, far more pharmacologically active, and far more important to approach with genuine caution. Because what comes next is not simply traditional. It is one of the clearest examples in the entire herbal world of a plant that can truly do something, and therefore must truly be respected. Number 4. St. John's wort. By midsummer, when the light lingers and the fields seem almost overfull with brightness, St. John's wort opens its yellow flowers like scattered stars. Hold one of its leaves up to the sun, and you can see the translucent dots that give the plant part of its mystery: tiny oil glands, tiny reservoirs of chemistry, tiny reminders that power often hides in structures too small to notice from a distance. Of all the plants on this list, this may be one of the least suited to casual treatment. Not because it is unimportant, but because it is important in a very real way. The Christian calendar came to associate this plant with the feast of St. John near midsummer, and that seasonal timing matters because older people paid close attention to when a plant reached its fullness. In Greek medical traditions, St. John's wort appeared in connection with nerve pain and inflammation. Medieval thinkers like Hildegard von Bingen wrote of it in ways that linked the plant to melancholy, strain, and forms of internal heaviness that were difficult to name. Surgeons in wartime traditions used it externally in wound contexts. Once again, the plant sits at a crossroads: emotional, neurological, and physical. Modern pharmacology has taken St. John's wort very seriously, and for good reason. The compounds hypericin and hyperforin have been extensively studied, particularly in relation to mood and neurotransmitter activity. Large reviews of the research, including high-level systematic analyses, have found that standardized extracts of St. John's wort may be helpful in mild to moderate depression in some contexts, with outcomes that have attracted substantial scientific attention. This is not fringe folklore surviving on romance. It is one of the better-researched medicinal plants in the world, and yet this is exactly why caution becomes essential. A plant with meaningful pharmacological activity can also meaningfully interact with the body's chemistry in ways that matter. St. John's wort is known to affect liver enzymes involved in metabolizing many prescription medications. That means it can interfere with things like oral contraceptives, certain blood thinners, some immunosuppressants, and a range of other drugs. This is not a decorative disclaimer, it is a real interaction with real consequences. If any plant on this list teaches the lesson that natural does not mean casual, it is this one. Its relationship with sunlight adds another layer. Hypericin is photosensitizing, which means some individuals may become more sensitive to sun exposure when using significant amounts. Again, the point is not fear. The point is respect. Traditional people often understood this intuitively. They knew that a potent plant required attention, proportion, timing, and experience. The modern world sometimes forgets that and moves too quickly from discovery to enthusiasm. Still, what is remarkable about St. John's wort is that it holds together two worlds many people assume must be separate. On one side, there is old observational knowledge, monastic medicine, folk use, centuries of careful noticing. On the other side, there are neurotransmitters, enzyme systems, clinical studies, and systematic reviews. The bridge between those worlds is this plant. It stands there as evidence that ancient practice was not always vague, and that modern science is not always the beginning of knowledge. Sometimes it is the later explanation of something earlier people had already learned to handle carefully. There is a solemn beauty in that. Street. John's wort is not comforting in the same way violet is comforting, nor nourishing in the same way nettle is nourishing. Its significance lies in the fact that it demands maturity from the person who approaches it. It asks not only curiosity, but judgment. Not only interest, but humility. And that is why it belongs near the end of this list. By now, the pattern is becoming unmistakable. The plants most people call weeds or relics are not minor at all. Some feed, some soothe, some restore, some act so strongly that they step into the territory we usually reserve for pharmaceuticals. The old world knew this. It did not romanticize plants. It learned them. Carefully. Slowly. Often at the pace of generations. And the next plant carries that ancient intimacy even further, because it was known so widely, used so broadly, and trusted so deeply that one of the greatest physicians in history is said to have called it his medicine chest. Number 3. Elder along riverbanks, hedgerows, and the edges of old settlements, elder has stood for centuries like a tree that remembers people. Not a grand cedar, not a towering oak, but something closer to daily life, closer to the hand, closer to the places where food, illness, weather, and household knowledge met. Its white blossoms arrive in airy clusters, almost cloud-like in late spring, and later the dark berries gather in heavy drooping umbels, ink-deep and unmistakable. There is something ancient about elder even before you know its history. It looks like a plant people would have trusted, and for a very long time, they did. In Ezekiel, there is a vision of trees whose fruit is for food and whose leaves are for healing, rooted beside living water. Elder belongs naturally to that symbolic world. Across Europe, the Near East, and beyond, it became one of those rare plants surrounded not just by use, but by reverence. It appears in Greek medical writing, in folk traditions from the British countryside to Central Europe, in Native American botanical knowledge, and in household medicine across generations so consistently that it earned a kind of legendary status. Hippocrates is often associated with the idea of elder as a medicine chest, and whether that phrase survived exactly as spoken or through tradition, it captures something true. Elder became a whole category of practical care in itself. That breadth matters. Most plants gain a reputation in one area. Elder seemed to gather many: blossoms for gentle seasonal preparations, berries for winter support, bark and leaves in older traditions, though often with greater caution. It was the kind of plant that stayed near the threshold between food and medicine, which is often where the most enduring plants in human history tend to live. Modern science has focused especially on elderberries' anthocyanins, the deeply colored flavonoid, compounds that give the ripe berries their dark, purple-black tone. These compounds, including cyanidin derivatives, have drawn attention for antioxidant activity and for their possible role in immune and viral response pathways. Some controlled studies have suggested that elderberry preparations may help shorten or lessen the severity of certain upper respiratory symptoms, though the language should remain careful and the evidence should not be overstated. What matters here is that elder has earned enough scientific respect to remain under active investigation, and that alone says something about the weight of its older reputation. But elder also teaches an important lesson in preparation. Not every useful plant is safe in every form. Raw elderberries, along with other parts of the plant such as leaves and bark, contain compounds that can cause nausea and other unpleasant effects if handled improperly. Traditional knowledge understood this. Heat was part of the wisdom. The berries were cooked, simmered into syrups, decoctions, and preserves until the dangerous edge gave way to something safer and more useful. This is one of the clearest reminders in the whole video that traditional plant use was never just about enthusiasm. It was about method. There is something beautiful in the transformation. The raw berry is sharp, a little forbidding, not yet ready, but under patient heat it becomes dark, fragrant, concentrated, almost ceremonial. Stirred with honey after cooling, stored in glass, taken in spoonfuls through cold months. Elderberry syrup feels like an inheritance from kitchens that understood winter very well. It belongs to a world where people did not wait for the body to collapse completely before reaching for support. They built support into the season itself. That may be why elder has stayed so vivid in memory. It was never only about the chemistry, though the chemistry matters. It was also about timing, preparedness, and relationship to the year. Blossoms in one season, berries in another. Gathering, drying, simmering, storing. Elder invited people into a rhythm of attention. And once a plant becomes part of seasonal rhythm, it becomes more than useful. It becomes trusted. Few plants carry that kind of trust across continents and centuries. Elder did. And as modern studies begin to describe the compounds, pathways, and measurable effects involved, the older world looks less superstitious and more observant than many people once assumed. The next plant, though, may be the most misunderstood of them all, blamed for a problem it does not cause, while quietly offering the very kind of support people have been seeking from it for generations. Number 2. Goldenrod. By late summer, when the fields begin to lean toward autumn and the air carries the first faint suggestion of dryness, goldenrod rises in bright yellow plumes as if the land itself were catching fire in slow motion. Roadsides blaze with it, meadows fill with it, Pollinators move through it in dense humming patterns. And yet, for all its beauty, goldenrod has spent generations being accused of something it did not do. Countless people have blamed it for seasonal allergies, simply because it blooms at the same time as ragweed. But goldenrod's pollen is heavy, sticky, and insect-borne. It does not drift through the air in the same way. It became guilty by association, and that may be one of the most revealing metaphors in the entire world of wild plants. Ancient traditions often preserved knowledge not only about what healed, but about the fact that healing plants were worth setting apart and remembering. Levitical purification imagery involves wild plant materials gathered for restorative rites, and while the exact identities remain debated, the principle itself matters. Certain plants were recognized as more than background. They were part of the cultural vocabulary of cleansing, renewal, and care. Goldenrod fits naturally into that wider ancient instinct, because wherever it grew, people eventually seemed to ask the same question: what can this bright plant do? Native American traditions produced a remarkable number of answers. Across multiple tribes and regions, goldenrod species were used in preparations connected to fever, urinary discomfort, wound care, respiratory strain, and general inflammation. European herbal traditions also recognized it, especially in contexts involving the urinary tract and seasonal support. Over time, goldenrod became one of those plants whose reputation was broad enough to demand serious attention. This was not one village's local superstition, it was a pattern of repeated use. Modern research has identified several classes of compounds that help explain why goldenrod held that place. Flavonoids such as rutin, along with saponins and phenolic acids, have been studied for anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and mild antimicrobial actions. Some European herbal monographs and regulatory frameworks have gone far enough to recognize goldenrod preparations as supportive in certain urinary tract contexts, especially where gentle flushing support is desired. That does not make it a cure-all, and it certainly does not remove the need for proper medical care in significant infections. But it does place goldenrod in a category few wild American roadside plants ever reach: formally acknowledged medicinal relevance. Its preparation is simple and elegant. The flowering tops, dried carefully, steep into a tea that is lighter and more pleasant than many people expect. Floral, soft, almost sunlit in character. There is something satisfying about that reversal. A plant blamed for making people miserable turns out to produce one of the gentler infusions on the list. That kind of irony seems to follow wild plants everywhere. We fear what we have not learned, and we often misname what we have not observed closely enough. Goldenrod is also a plant of timing. It appears near the turning of the season, exactly when bodies begin adjusting to cooler nights, changing air, and the first subtle stresses of autumn. Plants that arrive at transitional times often take on outsized meaning in traditional cultures because people feel transition in the body very clearly. Summer leaves. Cold approaches. Energy shifts. The plants appearing then were never random background decoration. They were noticed because timing itself mattered. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson of goldenrod. Misunderstanding can be astonishingly durable. A false reputation can outlast generations. Yet the plant remains what it is regardless: bright, useful, persistent, offering what it has always offered to anyone willing to look more carefully. In that sense, goldenrod is not just a medicinal herb, it is a correction, a reminder that the modern eye is not always the most accurate one. And now we come to the final plant, though in truth it is also a return. Because the story does not end with a new species, but with a deeper layer of one we have already met. By the time we reach number 1, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Number 1. Purslane revisited: the deeper story. We have already seen purslane as a nutritional marvel, a low-growing succulent with an omega-3 profile so unusual that it forces even skeptical people to look twice. But there is another layer to this plant, one that reaches beyond nutrient charts and into one of the most haunting scenes in Scripture. It is not a claim, it is not proof. It is something more interesting than either of those. It is a convergence. In 1 Kings chapter 19, Elijah collapses in the wilderness after one of the most overwhelming moments of his life. Just before this, he has stood at the center of a dramatic confrontation: fire, fear, public strain, vindication, pursuit. And then suddenly, the body gives way. He lies down under the sparse shelter of a tree and says, It is enough. He sleeps. He is awakened and given food and water. He sleeps again. He is awakened again with the instruction that feels as physical as it does spiritual. Rise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. And then, strengthened by that restoration, he travels 40 days and 40 nights. It is one of the most psychologically and physiologically precise scenes of exhaustion in ancient literature. Not merely sadness. Not merely hunger. Collapse. Sleep. Targeted nourishment. Recovery sufficient for endurance. The text does not tell us exactly what plant foods were present, and it would be irresponsible to pretend otherwise. But the landscape in which this event unfolds is part of the native range of purslane, and what modern science now knows about purslane makes that proximity feel profoundly interesting. Purslane contains omega-3 fatty acids in extraordinary concentrations for a land plant, especially alpha-linolenic acid. It contains magnesium and potassium, minerals frequently depleted under prolonged stress and physical exhaustion. It contains melatonin, a compound intimately tied to sleep regulation. It contains antioxidant pigments and micronutrients that support cellular resilience. In other words, the nutritional pattern present in this plant aligns strikingly well with the pattern of depletion and restoration described in Elijah's story. That is not the same thing as saying he ate purslane. It is something subtler. It is the recognition that the land itself held plants capable of supporting exactly the kind of exhausted body the text describes. And that recognition changes the emotional weight of the plant. Purslane stops being merely surprising and becomes almost symbolic. It becomes the image of provision hidden in plain sight, growing flat against the earth in hostile terrain, carrying within it compounds associated with calm, repair, and endurance. The body collapses. The land still offers something. Sleep returns. Strength returns. The journey continues. Ancient narrative and modern biochemistry do not often meet this elegantly, but here they come, close enough to make the mind pause. There is also something fitting about the fact that the plant at the center of this deeper reflection is one that most people still ignore. Not a rare alpine herb, not a rainforest treasure, not something locked away behind specialty pricing and wellness marketing. Purslane grows where heat is harsh, where soil is poor, where cracks open in pavement, where people look down and see only inconvenience. And yet, it carries one of the most unusual nutritional signatures in the entire terrestrial plant world. That may be the perfect ending for a list like this. Because in the end, the larger lesson was never just about weeds. It was about perception. It was about how modern people have been trained to separate food from place, healing from history, and value from the ordinary. These plants do not merely challenge that separation, they expose it. Look back across the full list and a deeper pattern comes into focus. Red clover, chickweed, wood sorrel, wild violet, mullein, lamb's quarters, dandelion, nettle, purslane, plantain, wild garlic, St. John's wort, elder, goldenrod. Different shapes, different flavors, different risks, different gifts. Yet again and again, the same principle appears. The older preparations were often gentler, closer to the living plant, less industrial, less extreme, raw where possible, lightly dried, steeped with care, heated only when necessary. They were methods shaped by attention, not by branding. Modern research has begun naming the compounds involved, but the old world had already discovered many of the practical truths through long observation. Heat does alter certain delicate compounds. Timing of harvest matters. Some plants must be cooked. Some must be strained. Some require real caution. Some offer more when left simple. The pattern is not romantic fantasy. It is accumulated practical intelligence. The people before us may not have known the words polyphenol, iridoid glycoside, mucilage, or melatonin, but they knew what returned strength, what settled irritation, what needed respect, what appeared in lean seasons, what the body seemed to welcome after winter, what gave relief in the throat, what sharpened dull food, what traveled well, what should never be eaten raw, what should be used only in small amounts, and what should be gathered before flowering. That kind of knowing deserves more honor than modern culture usually gives it. And perhaps that is the most important truth of all. Real food, lightly handled, seasonally gathered, close to the earth, may still have lessons for us, not because the past was perfect, but because attention was often deeper. People watched the body carefully. They watched the land carefully. They had to. So before you pull a single weed this week, pause. Look more closely. Take a photograph. Learn one name. Then another. You may discover that what modern culture taught you to destroy once fed households, traveled through scripture, stood in the notebooks of physicians, and is now quietly returning to scientific view from the edge of the lawn. If this kind of ancient science and quiet history speaks to you, you may want to subscribe for more slow, thoughtful journeys like this. Because sometimes the most extraordinary things are not hidden at all. They are simply growing where no one thinks to look.